my view here. Why I think you should read a book about Jakarta. So we're going to talk about why Jakarta in particular, the making of the book, how the book actually came to realization. But most of it is really about Jakarta throughout the centuries. We're going to talk how the city became as it is right now, and what kind of forces played a key role in shaping it. We're also going to talk about some of the challenges that Jakarta has. Even people that have not been in Jakarta have heard or read that it might not be the capital city of Indonesia anymore. It is sinking. It is on a regular basis flooding, and they're trying to work in it. So we're going to talk a little bit about these particular issues as well. But first, this particular slide. If people think about Jakarta, this is typically the kind of view that they get. It's a congested city, crowded, and particularly if it rains or floods, it's difficult to get through. And if you're a businessman and you go to Jakarta, you stay in one of the hotels, yeah, you will face this. And if you have, let's say you stay right in the city of Jakarta in the Mandarin Hotel, and you have lunch at the Hyatt Hotel on the opposite side, and you don't really move anything beyond that. And to be honest, a lot of people do that on their visit to Jakarta. This is the impression that you will get. It is a completely incomplete picture of the city. You miss out on a lot of things, and I will tell you what you're going to miss out on. But this is the sad reality. The city has grown much faster than the infrastructure can deal with. Now, quickly go here. I'm going to go back to 1990 because that's the first time that I arrived in Jakarta. On the upper left, you see a picture of myself backpacking through Indonesia. This is actually not Jakarta, but it's a hilltop on the island of Nias of the Indian Ocean, in the Indian Ocean of the Sumatran coast. Was a bit thinner in those days and had a bit of hair as well. But the important thing really is that while I was backpacking, it's that family that is on the other side, on the upper right. When I wanted to go backpacking in Jakarta, in Indonesia, in 1990, I consulted an uncle of mine who had been there. His wife is Indonesian Chinese. She grew up in Jakarta in the late 40s, early 50s, but then moved to Holland, and they've been back a couple of times. So I asked them where to go, and they said, avoid Jakarta. Don't go to Jakarta, at least not the very beginning. Go to Bali first, see all the other islands before you go to that large city, because it's kind of a monster of a city, very big, and you might get overwhelmed with it. And I took his advice at heart, and I flew to Bali. And that's why my backpacking trip started in Indonesia. And I went first to eastern Indonesia, island hopping, and then later on back towards Jakarta. That was my end destination. During that island hopping, I took ferries between the islands, and there was a family, an Indonesian family that was visiting friends and family that lived on a particular island on the same ferry as I was. And they had a little girl, 7 years old, and she was a bit sick from the swaying of the boat. So I gave her some water, and I gave her a bit of aspirin as well, said this might help you. And the family came, and we tried to talk, but my Indonesian, although I started to learn a little bit of Indonesian, was still quite bad. And so we struggled to converse, and that was about it. When the ferry then arrived on the island, I walked to a bus terminal to make my way to some kind of cheap hotel that I'd identified in the northern part of that island. And when I walked there was a car passing me, and it honked, the windows opened up, and the family was in there because they were picked up by their friends and family who lived on that island. They suggested I should jump in, so I hopped in and made my way to a city from where on. Initially, I thought I'd go to that kind of place where I wanted to visit, but yeah, during the trip there was about an hour's drive. They said, why don't you stay? We're staying in a hotel. We got a couple of rooms. You can actually stay with us. And I stayed with them for about 3 days. So we got to know each other, and they brought me around, and it was kind of a first immersion for me in Indonesian culture. They said, well, listen, we're from Jakarta, so why don't you give us a call when you're back in Jakarta? I said, well, that might be in 2 months' time. I said, no problem, drop by. And that's exactly what I did. So a couple of months later, and I think we're talking about September, October in 1990, I arrived in Jakarta by train, checked into some kind of cheap hotel in a street called Jalan Jaksa, and I gave them a call. They said, where are you now? I explained where I was, and they said, check out, we'll pick you up, you should stay at our place. And that's what I did. And instead of staying there for just, initially I thought for a couple of days, I extended my stay to almost 6 months. And over the years thereafter, actually, I came back to Jakarta for more travel. But that particular stay was much longer than anticipated. And I made a deal with that 7-year-old girl. I said, listen, your daughter, if she teaches me a bit of Indonesian, I will teach her English. And she's absolutely fluent in English at the moment, I can gladly say so. But the picture of Jakarta that I have is this picture. It's not that crowded street that I showed earlier on, but it's this little, what we call kampung, all kinds of alleys that are somewhat connected, as if it's a very small village. Everybody knows each other. People are very friendly. As this motorcyclist is there, they carry all kinds of goods around from one kampung to the other around Jakarta. And while I was there, I decided to go around and exploring this monster of a city, this large city, which now has close to 30 million people in it. I did it by train, by bus, simply by walking around, sometimes on the back of a motorcycle, whatever I had the opportunity. And I started to understand how the city actually was structured a little bit. I found it interesting and fascinating, but also I started to discover, I knew this already, but if you see it, it's a kind of second realization that there were still some remnants of the old Dutch period in there. At that time, I had a grandfather who told me, listen, I understand that there are some ancestors that we have that lived there in the past. You should maybe check out if you can find something of them. So I went to an old museum, the National Museum, asked them if they could help me out. They said, not really, actually, we don't know where to go. And I forgot about it until maybe actually 5 years later. So we go from 1990 to 2015 or so, when I suddenly realized I took that wrong. I don't know why it took so long for me to realize it, but I thought I need to go to the National Archives, of course. And this is what I did. I went to the National Archives, sat down for a couple of days to go through all kinds of books, and by accident found actually a reference to one of my family members, a member that had lived in Jakarta in the 1740s. And it was actually written down in a book that upon his death, when he passed away, they sent a plaque, a wooden plaque, to a church in Holland. They also had a couple of other details of him, and I know from another family book that we have in Holland that proved that he actually was a family member of mine. Now, back in Holland, I actually went to that church, called them and said, listen, there must be a plaque that you received in somewhere around the 1740s. They said, well, we don't know, but we can look it up. When are you coming? I said, well, in 3 days' time. They said, well, come by and we'll see what we have. And when I arrived in that church a couple of days later, they brought me to a small corner where in the corner, since 1740s, this wooden plaque had been hanging there, literally for hundreds of years already. And it says, the gentleman Johannes van der Linde, so that is my predecessor, my ancestor by about 10 generations. He was the upper purchasing manager, you could say, director of the company, which is the Dutch East Indies Company at the time, in search of spices in Indonesia, and also the head of the administration, the pennist, it says at the very top. And at the bottom it says he passed away in Batavia in 1742 on the 15th of October, and he became 35 years old, a little bit more, a few months and a couple of days. And you can see that I'm there on the left with my father beneath that plaque in that particular church. So we had made that connection. But when I was in these archives, I found a couple of references to all kinds of other family members as well. I was actually surprised to see how many people I could find. And yeah, you get interested and say, well, how did the city look like in those days? I've just tried to discover that city on my own, how it looks like, but what was it in their days? I found that the earliest one was a lady called Barbara that arrived even almost 100 years before this particular gentleman, Johannes van der Linde, who had this wooden plaque. A lady called Barbara arrived in the 1650s in Jakarta. You might wonder, how the hell there's a lady in the 1650s, why does she go to Jakarta, Batavia, such a place far away, which was still pretty much a wild frontier city at the time. So yes, the history of that city, how it was made, and my family became kind of intertwined. And as I did more research, I decided to write a book about this. But if you write a book about a city, you're going to figure out how to do that. And I wanted to put people very central to the book, because it was that extremely hospitable Indonesian family with that 7-year-old daughter, whose pictures we've just seen, that made that city for me. They brought me into, they allowed me to stay in the house for months. It's an hospitality that is, I think, almost unique to Indonesians. From there on, I explored the city. Then I found out my own people had stayed there. And over time, as I did research, I found all kinds of other people as well. So I dived into all kinds of archives in the Netherlands as well to find not only the history of the city, but also interesting stories of people that I could tell and whom around their stories I could build kind of the city of Jakarta as well. And that should then give us an idea of the progression of this city. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about right now. Now, the area of what is now Greater Jakarta, that includes a couple of cities, Bekasi, Tangerang, Bogor in the south, so Jabodetabek or Jabodetabek as it is called, that's about 30 million people or so. That area has been inhabited since a very long time, Neolithic times. But so have many other areas. That doesn't prove that there was a particular city. Maybe there were a couple of individuals who stayed there. The earliest proof that we have that there was actually a city is related to this particular stone that you see right here. This stone is from the year around 450. It's got, as you see, 2 footprints in it and some kind of wiggly inscriptions at the bottom, which are difficult to read for the very obvious reasons that this is not an Indonesian language, but it is actually an Indian language. Indian seafarers and traders had arrived in Java and Sumatra about, say, 400, 300 before Christ, had established relationships there and had also given them religion. Indonesia was to a large extent initially a Hindu country. It had given them also language and all kinds of other stories. Ramayana and Mahabharata, which are Hindu stories, are still very important in Indonesian culture. And on this stone is inscribed, basically, there are 2 things here. The wiggly kind of writing at the bottom, it says that there was a large feast organized by a king called Purnavarman, who digged a canal and had about 1,000 cows slaughtered at the very end to celebrate the finishing of this canal. There were about 20,000 people involved. But you don't build a canal in the middle of nowhere. There must have been, even just to house all these people, build it and dug it. There must have been a city, and we know now that that city was called Sundapura, the city of Sunda, and the people around West Java are still called the Sundanese. And the 2 feet at the very top is basically a kind of a link that he makes to Vishnu. Vishnu's feet were as large as his, it was stated, and therefore he had some kind of connection with the gods. But yeah, that infrastructure project whereby there was a city a little bit east of where Jakarta is right now in a sub-district called Bekasi, that's where a city was there. And there was infrastructure, so there was sufficient amount of people, and that infrastructure was a canal because, well, in the south you have the mountains. If it rains, the water flows to the sea, and they had to deal with it and channel that presumably through their fields or paddy fields or whatever they had. So that's the very first evidence that there was really a city called Sundapura, 450. Now, that was part of a kingdom. Purnavarman was the king. Kingdoms come, kingdoms go. Eventually, it all centered a little bit around another town further north on the coast called Kalapa. Kalapa means coconut, and Kalapa was a port town. It emerged probably a couple of 100 years after Sundapura, but we know that by the, say, 12, 13, 1400s, there are references in all kinds of writings and books, predominantly by actually Chinese travelers who went around the Indonesian and Malay archipelago, of a Kalapa. The Portuguese also arrived in the 1500s. They also mentioned Kalapa on their maps. And that is the kind of forefather, if you want to say it, of what is now Jakarta. And still in the very northern part of Jakarta, there's a district called Sunda Kelapa. That was a port town. People came there in order to bring peppers and spices and cows and whatever you wanted to trade to their town. And from there on, Arab traders, Malay traders, Indonesian traders arrived